and welcome to a very special event to launch the publication of the first ever SAGE Handbook of Participatory Research and Inquiry. My name's Peter Taylor. I'm Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies, and I'm really delighted today that we're able to host this webinar, bringing together not only the co-editors of the publication, but also a number of its contributors, and of course, participants in the webinar who are keen to learn more about the publication. So I'm really thrilled about this new SAGE Handbook because I believe it's going to speak to the interests of a really wide range of researchers, practitioners, and that very interesting eclectic community who sometimes call themselves pracademics. According to its overview, it aims to provide the most comprehensive source of contemporary cutting-edge approaches to participatory research methods and design, as well as the foundations of participatory research and critical practice issues. And participatory research has a really long history at IDS. It's been central to our work for a long time. We've participated and valued many partnerships and collaborations in different contexts. And we know that the participatory research community is very extensive, and their work over the past 20 years has contributed to a critical mass of knowledge, including this volume. And many would argue that participatory research has never been more relevant than it is today, from addressing the universal challenges of climate change, extreme poverty, social exclusion, or the impacts of a pandemic. Participatory processes are vital to help better understand these complex challenges, to help build solidarity, and to effect change. So today we're joined by the co-editors of the book, Danny Burns, Joe Howard, and Sonia Ospina. Danny Burns is a research professor and has worked at IDS since 2010, where he was leader of the Participation, Inclusion, and Social Change team. Before that, as co-director of Solar at the University of the West of England. Jo Howard is also a research fellow at IDS. She leads the Participation, Inclusion, and Social Change Research Cluster. And Sonia Ospina is a professor of public management and policy at the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. She's a sociologist by training and an expert in qualitative and participatory research. And all three have published widely, are deeply involved in processes of social change in a wide variety of contexts, and are leaders in the field of participatory research and inquiry. And of course, they're also widely published authors. And we're joined today by a number of the contributing authors to the publication from within IDS and externally. So welcome to you all, and Danny will introduce you all shortly. So Danny, first over to you. I'd like to ask you to give us a broad introduction to the importance of the handbook. And then after that, I'll turn to Sonia and Joe to tell us a little bit more about their motivations. Danny, over to you.
Make sure I'm unmuted. Thank you, Peter. Yes, well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here amongst all of you, a wider audience, but also some of our authors and our section editors. And I firstly wanted to give special thanks to my co-editors, Sonia and Joe. We couldn't have done this without doing it together because we were a team. And in fact, the wider team of all the section editors, I'll speak to a little bit later, but you did so much of the work of pulling all of this together. So thank you to all of you. And of course, 137 amazing authors. What a collection. So, you know, the start of this has to be to thank everyone for this huge voluntary effort. Everyone did it in their spare time. Nobody gets paid for it. And it's our gift to the world. So it's been a joy. I wanted to say something about context. Climate change, global pandemics, artificial intelligence, they're just some of the threats we face. You know, poverty and exploitation aren't getting better, they're getting worse. Civic space is closing down, it's not opening up. And these are complex issues and they're interconnected. And we need tools and processes that can engage with them systemically. We need to harness all of the different ways of knowing that are available to us. We need an engaged citizenry that's armed with our own evidence. And we need participatory sense-making processes which build ownership for action. And that's what this book is about. It's about participatory methods for social transformation. When we put this book together, we became clear in a sense about the context that we were operating in. The first was that there has been a huge explosion of research methods over the last 20 to 30 years. The second was that there's actually been quite a sort of a disparate documentation of that. There's a bit here and there's a bit there, and somebody's writing about this one over there. there was a real lack of detailed how-to guidance. Again, some of it's out there, some of it's not there at all. And actually, in terms of the bigger picture, there was a need for a much more confident assertion of the power of participatory research. An approach which has matured, which has come of age, which is sophisticated, which is detailed, which can challenge some of the critiques which have been made of it. And I think we need to stand up and confidently assert that. And that's in a sense what this book's been about. You know, we want to also assert what our values are, which is work with people and not on them, and methods which are appropriate to the questions that are being asked, that don't just exist somehow in their own right. Methods which really expose issues and questions and sense-making to scrutiny and contest it. Methods which harness the power of collective analysis, not just individual researchers in ivory towers making judgments on their own. And we need methods which are actually testing what we think in action. So, you know, I think we're at a critical juncture in history where these methods and the challenges that we face in the world come together. And this book is really about all of that. So as I said, 137 authors. The sort of the range of this book is extraordinary. I want to say a few words about that. So the book is split into sections. The first one is a foundation section. And it's really important to remember the wonderful, insightful thinking that was out there 40 or 50 years ago that shouldn't get lost. I mean, when I tried in chapter 2, when we were first drafting it, just think about, you know, what is participatory research? What are the foundations? What are the tenets? We couldn't do better than go back to people like Bud Hall and Patricia Maguire and use their words. So it's important to start there. The second section is about critical issues. And it's really important to remember that we can't do this work without understanding the power of facilitation. Facilitation is actually much more important than so much of traditional research methods. We can't do it without understanding positionality and power and so on. So the second section is really all about that. And again, we'll talk more about, you know, some of our authors and how they've been sort of developing these themes. And now I've just discovered that the screen sharing has covered my notes. So I'm just wondering if you could just take that off for a minute, Gary. Thank you. You're a star. Brilliant. The third section is about, as we come out of critical issues, is about dialogic processes. The foundations of all of our work is dialogic. Everything is about conversation, it's about engaging with each other. So we felt it was really important to articulate all of the different methods in that space. And Sonia had worked with Mariana de Santabanez on editing that process, that section. The next one, which is also, I sort of got a methods focus, is on digital technologies. So really it's trying to say, actually now there's a hugely expanded repertoire of different methods that are out there, from everything from from wikithons to citizen science to, you know, a whole range of different say approaches like digital mapping and GIS technology. So there's sort of an exciting sort of panoply of new things out there that we're starting to explore. The next section is on action-oriented approaches, which some may equate with action research. And here we're looking at action itself as a different way of knowing. And we're also thinking about action as a process which is embedded in our inquiry. So action leads to evidence and evidence leads to action, and that sort of ongoing cycle. And there's a whole range of different chapters that explore those issues. Thinking about different ways of knowing, the next section focuses on visual and performative methods that we learn by doing, enacting, by expressing, by drawing, by creating. And again, there's a whole range of new methods that are out there which explore those things. Participatory monitoring and evaluation, sort of almost like a new area in its own right. So many methods, from outcome harvesting to the reality check approach. There's a whole range of them there. Uses of sense maker and other sorts of approaches, which are finding their feet in the monitoring and evaluation space. Essentially all about how do we build learning into our processes. And then the final section is really on how do we integrate all of this with mainstream methods. You know, the whole essence of participatory research is that we find the answers to our questions by choosing the methodology that's appropriate, not by saying, okay, we do randomized control trials, we do qualitative interviews, but saying, what's our question? What do we need to know? So that can actually involve mixing qualitative research with quantitative research, with participatory methods. How are people doing that? And that's what this section is all about. So different section editors will talk to you about their pieces later on. Marina Apgar, Will Allen, Tessa Lewin, Jackie Shaw, Mary Bryden Miller, Alfredo Ortiz Aragon. I mentioned Mariana, and then Sonia and I and Joe also edited sections. And Tony Roberts. Nearly missed you out, Tony, sorry. But all of them will explain in a bit more detail what they've been doing in the later sections. Anyway, super exciting. The last thing I want to do is address the elephant in the room, which is how much does this book cost? Oh my God. As soon as you've seen it, you'll look at the Sage website and think, I can't afford that. And it's true. It's the paradox of the world that we're living in. So I think the reality of this is that we knew this. We understood that we needed to put together this collection at this time, which was legitimated by the leading methodology publisher in the world, and which actually gave an incentive to 71 chapters to 137 authors to put their time into this voluntarily. From a perspective of putting all of this into the world and building a critical mass, that was the path we needed to take. However, we recognize that essentially this hardback version will be a library resource, apart from the die-hard enthusiasts that must have this as their Bible by their beds in order to do their work. The electronic versions are much more reasonable in terms of price. And I think it's probably important to be aware that this book is 6 times the size of the average book that would go out on this scale. 71 chapters, it's over 1,000 pages long. And that works out at just under about £2 a chapter, which is actually good value. It doesn't mean you can necessarily find that money straight away. But what I would say is when people in organizations are saying, I'm going to send someone on a course for 700 or 800 quid, or 1,000 quid. Just think about the value of 100 or so for 71 of the leading practitioners, or 137, really articulating in detail their experience, their knowledge, the ways in which they've done their work, the detailed how-to guidance. So for organizations and participatory facilitators, I would say that's good value. However, there's still going to be a whole group of people that can't afford this. And I would say to them, the first thing is that authors are able to give out their chapters individually one-to-one. So approach authors on issues that you think are important directly, and they'll be able to give out their chapters one-to-one. The second is that we're going to be purchasing a whole bunch of books, and we're going to make sure that they go out to all of the key centers of participatory practice who are in countries and in places where people can't afford them, so that the community has them. And we've also committed to make sure that any royalties that come as a result of the sale of the book go plowed back into giving the book back out to people that can't afford it, and to putting resources onto the web. The third bit is that we have a participatory methods website, and we want to encourage all of our authors to put shorter versions, 4-page summaries, PowerPoints, anything else that sort of that supports their chapters into that section. And I think the fourth one is just to say, I think good knowledge will always find its way. And people will find ways of getting this stuff out. So I think on that note, I just wanted to say, we're just super proud that all of you have come together to produce this amazing resource. We're super proud to share it with this wider community that's here in this virtual room. Let's try to make use of this to actually create some real change in the world. And once again, thank you to everyone that's been involved.
Danny, and I think you've really given a good explanation of what the scale and scope of this book is, not to mention the weight that if you were actually literally to hold it is quite considerable. And I think just the practice and theoretical contributions are enormous and very, very
quite heavy.
There we are. So there's a workout there, Danny, just by lifting a volume in each hand. There's a good sort of physical fitness dimension as well. But it's tremendous contribution, and clearly there's going to be a lot of interest in it. And we hope that today we're going to give everyone a chance just to dive in a little bit and get a bit of a taste, as well as further sessions during the course of this week, where there are actually going to be some online events which will allow participants to get a sense of, more depth of some of the content. But first, Danny, thanks so much for giving that introduction. I think it really demonstrates the passion and the commitment and the effort that's gone into it. So I'd just like to turn to your co-editors, to Sonia and Joe, and just to hear from both of you a little bit about what motivated you to work on this project. Sonia, could I turn to you first? And you're muted.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. Morning here in New York, afternoon and late night or evening somewhere else, but I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I was thinking about this motivation, and I came up with 3 Ps. A practical one, which is, Danny already talked about it, which is that all of this wonderful material out there floating around in different places. And the idea of thinking about a single repository was very, very appealing in terms of the importance of being able to have a place to go to. And so that's kind of like the practical motivation. There was a political motivation, which is a book that is focusing on social exclusion and inequality and the transformative processes that produce some social justice was to me very, very appealing. The idea that we could make a statement about the importance of knowledge development and participatory knowledge development for changing the world was really a very important value that I wanted to be part of. And the personal was I wanted to work with Danny and Joe, and that was really an amazing experience. 3 years of learning between the 3 of us, and then with all the other editors and authors was fantastic.
Thanks, Sonia. Joe, what motivated you?
It was brilliant, Sonia, and it shows why we managed to work through this long and sometimes complicated process so well, is because we're in harmony, because I thought along very similar lines in terms of my motivations. And I guess a slightly, just to embellish a bit, that I think the kind of political motivation is that I'd long felt that research needed to be able to address the complex issues that weren't really getting properly worked through, and working in different, both in kind of practice and in academia over years, that when things really seemed to make a difference is when there were really participatory and collaborative approaches going on. And so the opportunity to bring together practitioner and researcher experience, knowledge, wisdom into, well, 2 volumes, not just 1, was such a great opportunity. And to draw on, and I suppose sort of a bit the personal as well, but to draw on knowledge and processes from different parts of the world. So having spent time living and working in Latin America, I felt so passionately about the knowledge and the experience from that part of the world, and to bring that into the international development and the national and domestic worlds of community and community development as well. And I suppose another motivation, it was came about when I started my PhD, and I went to a lovely a lovely meeting, invited along by ESRC, and they talked to us about research methods training, and there was no mention of participatory research. And I was like, well, what about, and they thought, well, yeah, well, that's a good question. We don't really know about that. So how can there not be resources and know-how in the kind of for PhD researchers on participatory research? So this again was a kind of great opportunity to bring that together and really make it available, accessible in a meaningful way to researchers. And on the very personal level, working with Danny and Sonia and with all the amazing, many of the amazing people who we've been working with are here. I think to be part of this community, producing and thinking about and reflecting on this work is a huge privilege. So that was a great motivation for me.
Thanks, Joe. And just to say too, right now there are 120 participants on the call, and I just quickly skimmed across, as difficult as this with the little thumbnails, and it's just so great to see so many of that broader community of practitioners and researchers in this field, some of whom have been or are participants on the MA Participation Social Change at IDS, but also from a much wider array as well of organizations and groups and communities that have long been a part of this enormously rich community of committed people. So again, welcome to everybody who's joining here. Sonia, let me come back to you for one more quick question. What do you see as the substantive contribution of this volume? Clearly it's a huge piece of work. There's a lot in it. What would you pick out?
If I had to choose one thing, is I would go back to the idea of a single repository that has both, like a deep discussion of the influences and the, like what is at the core and the main people who have contributed in the past, but also the people who are contributing in the present. So kind of like the pioneers and the innovators working together, presenting, being featured within the same book, and at the same time, all the philosophical and political assumptions being connected and married to a very practical way of developing the chapters, where we asked the authors to make sure that they would give an example that would have a step 1, step 2, step 3, without saying that it's a formulaic way of there is a formula, but offering someone who wants to do this for the first time or has the curiosity to do it a very straightforward path that they could follow and a very good example that they could follow. And if somebody is very well deepened into the practice, new ideas of how to do things also. And so it's a lot, the contribution is about, like you were saying, the depth and scale that we were able to get together.
Thanks, Sonia. And I think you picked out too the huge value of the many how-to examples, which give really concrete examples of how people have actually done this and how these processes have worked. I think that's a tremendous resource, which people are going to find extremely useful. Joe, what would you pick out as the substantive contribution of this volume?
So I think I would just add to that it makes a really robust case for taking participatory research seriously, for bringing it, I'm hesitate to say into the mainstream because that maybe has the wrong connotations, but to be up there, to be a proper big player that people should take seriously and should look to in their research repertoire. And probably here we're talking to the converted already, but I think we can take this these additions and say, look, these make a substantive and important contribution to how we can develop knowledge together and make a really strong case for thinking about participatory approaches to knowledge creation as being fundamentally important in the research and practice worlds.
Thanks, Joe. So I think now, hopefully everyone listening today has got a sense of what this publication is about overall, broadly, what the kind of content is and the approach and what's motivated its generation. It's taken a number of years of the co-editors and contributors' lives, but I think the output is very now tangible and concretely there, which others will be able to access and read. So now, in the spirit of opening it up, we have a chance for those participating in this webinar to dive in a little bit into some of the sessions. And I just wanted to say too that actually David Archer just in the notes made a really nice point that yesterday was Paulo Freire's 100th birthday. Whether that's a beautiful accident or synchronicity or serendipity, I'm not sure, but it just does seem really appropriate that we have this opportunity to come together today to be celebrating the launch of this publication. So thanks, David, for alerting us to that. And also, Danny noted too that in going through the contributors and those who are joining us today, we also have Paulina Oosterhoff, who is section editor of the mixing and mashing session, which is going to be one of the breakouts there now as well. So what's going to happen now? Time to dive into the content in a bit more detail. We're going to invite participants to choose which handbook section you would like to hear more about. These are taster sessions. It won't be possible to go into huge depth, but you will get to hear from the hosts of each of the sessions what that section of the book is about. And then there are going to be more events during the rest of the week, which you'll be able to participate in if you have time and interest, where you can find out more details. So we have 5 choices: dialogic and action-oriented participatory research. Secondly, digital technologies. Thirdly, participatory monitoring, evaluation and learning. Fourthly, visual and performative methods. And 5th, mixed methods. And actually in the chat, you can see them all, so you don't have to sort of hold it in your mind from the list I've just given. And Gary, if we can turn to you, just to explain how everybody practically can choose. And just to remind you, the inevitable Zoom heartbreak that after 15 minutes, everybody will be cast out of the Zoom room back into this plenary. But we do hope, if we use our time well, to have at least a few minutes to maybe just gather a few quick insights from the groups, just to kind of hear just, you know, some of the key learnings which have come out, and then we'll be aiming to wrap up on the hour.
Okay. Well, probably over to Sonia first, because, well, this breakout room 0 is really a space for anyone who wanted to, or is an author of, and David, I see you there, it's lovely to see you, who would like to discuss one of the 2 sections at the start of the handbook. The first one is on foundations and influences of participatory research. And the second section is the critical issues in the design and practice of participatory research. So maybe Sonia, if you'd like to start by saying a little bit about the foundation section, and then I'll say a little bit about the critical issue section, and then we can just have a chat.
Sure. So I'm just going to apologize for the authors that I'm not going to read their names just because of time issue, but they will see their chapter there. So basically the goal of this section is to make sure that the reader can reconstruct historical roots and identify the philosophical and political and theoretical foundations that underpin the research decisions that people make when they're making participatory research. And we, we curated lots of very, very interesting chapters, and then doing a little bit of inductive work, classify them into 3 categories according from what we got, in addition to what the instructions we gave, what the authors put themselves, how the authors put themselves into the chapter. And so there are a total of 12 chapters, including an introduction. And of those, there's a first bundle of chapters that basically feature 3 groundbreaking paradigmatic pioneers. So we have Paulo Freire with his popular education, Fals Borda with the critical recovery of history and PAR, the beginnings of PAR, and Augusto Boal with his theater and dialogue. And the common thread here is that the relevance of the link between dialogue, knowledge production, and power. That goes through all the others, but here it's very clear in these 3 featured pioneers. Then the next set is about worldviews and philosophies that really could make an important contribution to what's going on. And so here we have pragmatism, feminism, indigenous ways of knowing, participatory rural appraisal as a development approach, and the Scandinavian participatory research of large scale reform, and UK action research traditions. And the third category, I would say, is the 2 chapters that actualize very important concepts in the field, the extended epistemologies concept and the participatory spirit. And in terms of the extended epistemology, the author does a great job at bringing also a connection from the South, the decolonization of knowledge. And for the participatory spirit, the author brings the idea of the participative self and the importance of subjectivities, intersubjectivities, and interdependencies. So we put them at last because they actualize, they kind of like bring really to the present a lot of the issues in the other chapters. I was really incredibly happy with this list of chapters, and I would love to talk more about it, but let me just make sure that Joe can describe the next section, and then we can just go wherever people want.
Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, well, the design and critical issues section, the critical issues in the design and practice of participatory research came about because we felt that they needed a special section to really address things that don't necessarily get included in methods handbooks, which have to do with the principles and values that cut across participatory research and that are really important in both the design and the facilitation of the research process. And so this is about reflexivity, it's about inclusiveness, and it's about how we take a critical approach to shifting power in the research process, which is fundamental across all the chapters in the handbook. And so it's thinking about the relationship between the facilitator and the co-researchers. It's thinking deeply about what facilitation is and how we do it, and about those power dynamics between the facilitator and the co-researchers, but also between different organizations and institutions, and within groups, research groups, and between groups in the research process. And I guess there were some kind of core areas that came out within the section. One is about understanding our own biases and being able to work from there to think about how we bring, how we position ourselves, and how we develop as researchers, how we develop attitudes and practices for inclusiveness, how we consciously facilitate reversals of power in our research process. And also, and perhaps even most importantly of all, is how we open ourselves and work with others to recognize and work with the knowledge and priorities of the people that we're doing research with. And and finally, that kind of how thinking about the movement in the research process from the individual to the group and to the wider community and the system. So these are features that come out in many of the section 4 chapters, the specific case studies and how-to chapters, but that cut across and that we wanted to draw particular attention to. And so again, I won't read out all the names of the authors, but we go from facilitation to reflexivity to positionality, ethics, a specific chapter on ethics, even though ethics cuts across the whole section. There's a chapter on emotion, which we highlight as something that's really important and has increased in importance and salience, I think, in the participatory research world. There's a chapter on power analysis, one on co-producing participatory research between universities and communities, working with children and young people, working with people with disabilities, and finally a chapter that focuses on participatory action research in conflict settings. So that's the kind of the big picture of that section. And it would be nice now really to open up, maybe first of all to authors. David, would you like to comment at all on your experience of being an author in section 2? Share a bit with us the experience.
Well, actually, that's why I stayed in this room.
Good.
To begin with, I'd really like to congratulate you, the editorial team, on this venture. This is really a staggeringly large adventure. It's certainly the most responsibly diverse view of the subject that exists. almost every other example of a kind of scope book misses many of these dimensions. But the other thing, just from my own personal point of view, the experience of writing under Sonia's criticism and direction is certainly the best I've had in doing it. I've done the three handbooks of action research, getting very little editorial guidance. Here, there was a sense that you had a project among the three of you and some agreements that you were following in order to give the authors some kind of guidance. And that suggests to me that the chapters are going to be much more useful than this kind of bouquet model of handbooks where there's no relationship among the chapters. How you manage to put the energy together and the logistics together is a mystery to me. At my age, it seems almost impossible. Then there was another thing that had nothing to do with the chapter, but a comment because of what Danny said about the cost of the book. I'm wondering if it would be possible to put together a crowdfunding exercise, both among the authors and other interested parties, to create a fund maybe that could be set at IDS.
Great idea.
That people could then apply to get a copy of the book. Because I think otherwise it's really going to be extremely difficult for many people.
That's a great idea.
So anyway, congratulations and thank you very much.
And thank you for your chapter. Well, let's have a follow-up conversation on that idea.
Right.
Thank you so much. And thanks for appreciating the editorial process. I mean, you were in superbly competent and sensitive hands with Sonia, but we did work hard, the three of us, to bring coherence to the different sections. A little of it was happenstance, and we moved some chapters around, thinking, oh, actually that one fits better with the kind of the journey that this section is going through, and others were more straightforward to design. But it was really nice to hear that. Thank you.
We have 5 more minutes, Gary says.
Okay.
Gary
I
just
think
said.
Dina and Natalia had their hands up. Dina, do you want to come in?
Hi, how are you? Sorry, my camera isn't working, but it's really lovely to see your faces. And I also want to echo congratulations. This looks very exciting, and I am sure it was a massive accomplishment. So congratulations. I think I wanted to, part of the reason why I stayed in this group is because I was interested from your kind of editorial vantage point about the kinds of, I wanted to hear more a little bit about the kinds of geographies and the contexts which the case studies are based in. And I was thinking actually of the conversation that I had with Jo at the start of my PhD, which she doesn't remember probably because it wasn't as meaningful to her as it must have been to me. But we were talking about participatory methods in difficult settings and authoritarian settings and restrictive settings. And one of the points that you had raised was about what the literature looks like in this front. So I think I wanted to hear a little bit more about the case studies, the range of the case studies that you have in this handbook, and how much of that, directly explores the usage of participatory methods in places where there's a, let's call it an institutional inhospitality to those types of methods. I'll just stop at that. And thank you again, and congratulations. I do echo that there's a great need for crowdsourced funding, because I would love to get my hands on this book, and I definitely don't have the money for it.
I would just say about the geography in general that we were very, very careful to try to make sure that there were cases from mostly around the world. There are places that fell through the cracks, but I think we got a good representation. And also several chapters about hard, institutional contexts, like where there's a lot of conflict. I wonder, Jo and Danny, if you remember if there is any particular chapter specifically about regimes that are authoritarian. I'm not sure. I don't.
Well, the conflict chapter of Daniel Hislop addresses some of those questions. My chapter on systemic action research has got something of a reference to Myanmar, action research in Myanmar. And there are a few. There's some of the South American chapters which talk about as far as I remember, Sonia, some of the issues about operating in quite restrictive contexts. I mean, I think you're right. My sense is that we didn't cover everywhere. In fact, there are some gaps. Like, for example, China is a big gap in the handbook. And China and Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, we didn't have good connections, or couldn't find good authors or relevant authors. So there are some gaps. And there are some, sorry, go on, Joe.
So we have another hand up before we get whisked out of our breakout room. No, before everyone comes back, actually, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah, right.
Kalyan, you had a question.
Oh, yes. So good evening from India, and thank you very much for putting these resources together. Many, many congratulations, and I hope I'll be able to get hold of this book very soon. I was wondering if there is any section in this book, handbook, about psychological aspects of participation. I mean, how participation enhances empowerment in terms of cognitive psychology. I mean, is there any cognitive psychological explanation of how participation enhances empowerment?
I think I remember reading several chapters that had a cognitive psychology perspective. If I remember correctly, if I can assume what you mean by cognitive psychology, but a lot of the psychological elements associated with this. So you won't find a single chapter specifically about that, but you will find several different chapters. For example, several of the chapters on learning that highlight the issue of learning are really focused on that.
I was thinking that some of this is relatively new, and one of the things that might be worth doing is also following up some of the projects that are sort of signaled in the book, which are actually happening now. So, for example, in our Clarissa program, which is working on worst forms of child labor, our colleagues Marina and Mika have done a very careful realist review of the mechanisms which lead from the participatory process to the empowerment or to the action. And that is built into the evaluation process. So as the findings of that emerge, we'll get sort of more insight into the sort of the very specific mechanisms of how different facilitation practices, for example, lead to different sorts of outcomes. But I think some of that's new. It's sort of hinted at or signaled in the book, but it's probably the last 2 or 3 years practice rather than the last 10.
That's wonderful. So it's very exciting. Looking forward to reading those chapters. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would just add that so in the section that I was talking about, critical issues, section 3, the chapter that Bob Dickra has written about facilitating participatory research really does think very deeply about how people learn and what the facilitator's role is in enabling that. So I think that might be an interesting one for you, Kalyan, and other ones in that, like the one on emotions and power analysis. In fact, the whole section, but emotions, thinking about how we engage not only cognitively and theoretically, but also in embodied and emotional ways, and how that's part of how we both understand what's happened and also process that, critically engage with it, and then develop actions from it, and the role of emotions in that process. So
yeah, in the dialogic section, I think you also particularly, I can remember Barry Percy Smith's chapter on creating spaces for participatory social learning and change will probably have some of that too. So there's a lot out there in there.
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
And I can see everyone's coming back now, and and everybody's no doubt super frustrated that wasn't enough time to do anything, right? But it's supposed to whet your appetites for other sessions, and perhaps we should think of another session, David, because that was a very short one in order to talk about the foundations and influences section.
Right. Two different big pieces of the handbook, actually, that is true. But I also wanted to announce, I don't know if everyone is here yet, some people may have still to come, that in addition to the events in the Participatory Week, in October and November, we have at least 2 more events coming organized from the Wagner School, the partner institution, that will focus more on the dialogic component, and with a focus on the idea of public management and policy and the implications for that. And then we also plan to have an event in Spanish, because we had sufficient Spanish-speaking authors writing in English who can translate their stuff in PowerPoints. And so we're still figuring out how we're going to do that, but we will have something that's specifically focusing on the Latin American, the Spanish community, which, as you know, is well embedded in participatory action research and even from its origins. And so it's worthwhile doing that. So just be aware that that's coming in October.
And Sonia, I mean, if anyone wants to organize an event, then just let us know. I had an email this morning from one of our good colleagues in Italy saying he wanted to organize an event in Italy. So, you know, let's try and make this global and use different events across the world to just spread the knowledge and the word that all of this is coming out.
Fantastic. How was it for people in the little mini conversations that started but never finished? Anybody would like to just bring a highlight?
I think we had a really good discussion, Sonia. Very rushed, trying to get through all of the different contributions in the chapter, and then luckily we had someone from one of the co-authors was in there to illuminate one of the chapters. And I think we had time for one question, which was cut off a little bit short, but worth doing. Thank you.
Sonia, I think Mariana posted something that said that Kalyan had a question. Kalyan, did you have a question?
I think that was
no, that
you already answered.
It's already answered. I forgot to lower my hand. Sorry for that.
I have a reflection from our group, much like Tony's. It was quite rushed. But there was one reflection on the focus on method versus process and design, right? And I sort of shared that in our section, because it was chapters focused on methods, that trying to find the balance of sufficient practical sort of guidance, but I wouldn't maybe go as far as how to, and more sort of critical reflection on the context within which you're using that method and how you navigate that, which in the evaluation space is particularly important because it's quite a closed and accountability driven space. So that was one reflection to share back.
Anyone else like to give a quick insight into what happened in their group? Tessa?
Yeah, sure. It was very rushed. We all got to introduce ourselves, which was really nice. And we talked about the kind of long form things rather than Robert raised the fact that he hadn't seen much on causal and linkage diagramming and why wasn't that represented. And we said that it might be within the individual chapters. And we talked about the fact that we had tried to encourage people who hadn't theorized their work before in our section, but were well known for doing interesting practice or had done particular project that we really admired. So yeah, we did a very high speed tour through the 7 chapters of our section.
Might be worth noting, thanks Tessa on that, obviously one of the points that was raised earlier was that we moved some chapters from section to section, and some chapters in some sections could easily have been in another section. So actually there are other chapters. For example, the chapter I wrote on systemic action research has a lot on causal diagramming, just to raise the point that you raised, but it's in a completely different section. It's in Mario and Alfredo's section. And I guess there's probably other chapters like that, which are very much using visual methods, but they're also embedded in other sections. I know there's a lot in Paulina's section.
Yeah, Paulina, any quick insights from your group?
Yeah, I think in my group, the main questions were about what are the benefits of combining, for example, statistics with or RCT type of designs, which are pretty extractive or are known to be extractive, with more participatory approaches, and how people can do that in an ethical way and an accountable way. Mostly because the authors in this section were dealing mostly with marginalized or invisible populations, for which there are no lists available, often for very good reasons. So it would be very difficult to do a sample listing, which is what you would need for statistical analysis. It raises questions. So we discussed that mostly, that combination.
Thanks, Paulina. Now we're heading down to the wire. So I'm just going to say to the co-editors, Joe, Sonia, Danny, do you have literally a 30-second insight you just want to share with us before we have a few quick closing mentions about what's coming very soon for this week? Danny, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I think maybe I just want to reiterate the point that was made by Sonia earlier, which is that there is a power in critical mass. There's a power of bringing all of this stuff together into one place. And that that gives legitimacy to what all of us have been working our way on in our separate places, you know, for so long. It brings a legitimacy to us. So I think if we can use that collective power and acknowledge it, then we can perhaps get further than we could have done if we were just ploughing our own furrows. And I think that's why we chose to use this vehicle to bring everything together in a curated volume, rather than just to somehow pull together the different bits that everyone had been doing in their separate spaces.
Great, thanks, Danny. Joe?
Well, just seeing Mary's post now, and the fact that I feel so delighted seeing so many faces and names, that how important this kind of community and network is, and that the handbook has enabled us to strengthen that network, and hopefully through these events we can put more people in touch. And it is through making these connections and sharing ideas and sharing learning and so on that we can really grow. So that really strengthening the network.
Thanks, Joe. And Sonia, the last word.
I wanted to highlight a paradox that we have towards the future, which is the idea of legitimizing and bringing to the core robust, rich, within the robust, rich methods, the idea of participatory research on the one hand, and then on the other hand, keeping its radical edge so that it doesn't just get swallowed by traditional ways of thinking, right? So it's an interesting paradox. We want both things at the same time. And hopefully this book contributes to that, but we all as a community have to contribute to that too.
Brilliant, thanks, Sonia. So just to say, in the chat, you will find links to certain resources so you can go in more deeply. There is a link to the table of contents. There is a link to the participatorymethods.org website, where you can find a great wealth of material, including, I believe, some extracts from the book, some very selected extracts. But of course, you can also see, as you heard earlier from Danny, the authors, and then the possibility to perhaps contact the authors if you'd like to get in touch and get more information about the content. And then also happening this week is a series of events. This is Participation Research Week, and so many of those who spoke today or who have authored chapters are going to be online and opening up a conversation with those who would like to discuss more or find out more about some of the specific elements which are included in the book, and the link is there in the chat as well. So I think one of the things that we've heard is that this is not only a fantastic volume, and congratulations to everyone who's involved in it. It's really exciting, it's really inspiring, and it's going to be a hugely important resource and a reference point for ideas and practice for this ever-growing community of participatory researchers. We've got so many familiar faces being commented on in the chat here today, but this is a growing community, and there are many in that community who are not present today, some whom we know, and there are others who we don't know. So I think one of the real excitements now is to help share information about this more widely and encourage the dialogue and communication to continue taking place. So congratulations again, particularly thanks to Sonia, Joe and Danny. Thanks to all the authors who also participated today. Thanks to Gary for steering us through the maze into our groups and coming back again, somehow more or less intact. A really good conversation, and looking forward very much to seeing how all of this continues to unfold. Thanks once again, and bye for now.
Thanks, Peter.